Greetings and salutations, Madam Najiha. My name is Tengku Menawi bin Tengku Mene, matrix number UDE210129, and today my group, Group 2, will be presenting a group assignment for financial management.
Assalamualaikum, madam. My name is Nur Farahliana binti Muhammad Firdaus and my matrix number is UDE210096. Today, I would like to give a little characterization about the background of Mr. DIY. Mr. DIY is a hardware store that sells household items, cars, and so on. The founder of Mr. DIY is Tan Yuye. Tan Yuye is a graduate of University of Malaya with a degree in physics. Mr. DIY was established in 2005, located at Jalan Tuanku Abdul Rahman, Kuala Lumpur. After several years of operation, Tan Yuye intends to work with his brother, which is Tan Yuye, to further develop their existing business. Mr. DIY offers affordable prices to his customers, and this can help Malaysians who are less able to buy their necessities at a low price but quality. Next, I would like to pass to Fatin to give a little bit info about Mr. DIY recent project. Thank you.
Thank you, Farah. Hi, I'm Fatin and now I'm going to present about Mr. DIY recent project. Mr. DIY now works with few hypermarkets such as Aeon and Tesco. They open branches in strategic areas to attract more customers to visit their hardware store. It also analyzes the product preferred by customer and obviously it's useful in expanding the business. Mr. DIY also succeed attracting the foreign investor to invest in their business and create some few brand which is Mr. Toy and Mr. Dollar. Now there are 800 plus of stores are open throughout Malaysia and it sells variety of product in the stores, which is include hardware, car accessories, stationaries and even household that needed by the market demand. And that's all for me today about Mr. DIY recent project, and now I'm going to pass to my friend Shazwani.
Now we can start discussing about the liquidity ratios on the current ratios. We can see that the current ratios on 2019 is 3.141 and 2020 is 1.74. In 2019 means that the company is able to pay its current obligation with its current asset by the ratio of 3.41. And Mr. DIY have more sufficient current asset to cover the debt. But at the same time, it is also stated that there are too much of working capital. Compared to 2020, Mr. DIY current ratio is 1.74, although it is lower than the year before, but the current ratio is still enough to pay off the debt at the end of the year. Moving forward to the acid test ratios, which is in 2019, it is 1.18 and 2020 is 0.41. What we can interpret about the acid test ratio on 2019 is that Mr. DIY have adequate asset that can instantly be liquidated by the company to pay off all its current liability. It is because the acid test ratio is more than 1, which is 1.18 after deducting the amount of inventory. Meanwhile, on 2020, Mr. DIY does not have adequate asset that can instantly be liquidated by the company to pay off all its current liabilities on 2020. The acid test ratio is less than 1, which is 0.42. Now, for 2019, the inventory turnover is 2.64 and 2020 is 2.13 times. On 2019, Mr. DIY has replaced or purchased new inventory for 2.64 times. It shows that the inventory was sold out more efficiently, and we can see that the Mr. DIY are managing well with the inventory. Meanwhile, on 2020, Mr. DIY has replaced or purchased no inventory for 2.13 times. This has shows that their sales are not that good if compared to the previous year. And now for inventory turnover days. On 2019, the inventory turnover days is 138.1 days and 2020 is 172.06 days. In 2019, Mr. DIY takes 138.1 days to finish its inventory because before they replace it with new stocks. Mr. DIY are able to sell out the stocks in a shorter period, which is 3 3 to 4 months. In 2020, Mr. DIY takes 172.06 days to finish its inventory before they replace it with a new stocks. This has shown that Mr. DIY takes longer to sell out and clear off all of the stocks. There are several ways of the marketing department can do is that they can try to do more promotion about their products and they can also lower their product price. That is my explanation. Now I will pass it to Pravin to explain on the accounts receivable turnover ratio.
Thank you, Shaz. Next, I will continue with accounts payable turnover ratio and turnover days, and also accounts receivable turnover ratio and turnover days. Madam and my fellow friends, my name is Praveen and my matrix number is UDE210108. Today, I would like to talk about accounts receivable turnover ratio and also accounts payable turnover ratio based on my group assignment. So in year 2019, the accounts receivable turnover ratio is 18.68 times, and the average account receivable turnover in 365 days would be 19.54. In year 2020, the account receivable turnover ratio is 20.03 times. The average accounts receivable turnover in 365 days would be 18.27. So let's talk about the accounts payable turnover ratio. In year 2019, the accounts payable turnover ratio is 17.15 times, and also the average accounts payable turnover in 365 days would be 21.28. Meanwhile, in year 2020, the accounts payable turnover ratio is 21.82 times, and also the average accounts payable turnover in 366 days would be 16.77. So that's all from me. Next, I will pass it to Munawir to explain about earnings per share ratio. Thank you.
Greetings and salutations, madam. My name is Tengku Menawi bin Tengku Mene. I'll be presenting part B of the group assignment. My matrix number is UDE210129. Now let's start. So for earnings per share for 2019, I've calculated that for every ordinary share held by the shareholders, Mr. DIY has earned 5.06 cents of income, which may either be distributed to ordinary shareholders as dividends or be kept in the firm as retained earnings, but still belong to ordinary shareholders. For 2020, I've calculated that for every ordinary share held by the shareholders, Mr. DIY has an increased income of 5.37 cents, which may either be distributed to ordinary shareholders as dividends or be kept in the firm as retained earnings, but still belong to ordinary shareholders. Now, for return on capital employed for 2019, I've calculated that for every RM1 of funding provided by the management of Mr. DIY, the firm is able to earn a return of 0.2734 cents annually on average. For 2020, I've calculated that for every RM1 of funding provided to the management of Mr. DIY, the firm is able to earn a decreased return of 0.2646 cents annually on average. That concludes my part. Thank you. Next, I'll pass it for Gavin to continue.
Thank you, Munawir. Before I start, I would like to say a very good day to Madam Najiha. My name is Gavin Chong and my matrix number is UDE210168. In today's presentation, I will present about the return on asset ratio and return on equity ratio. First of all, return on asset. We can see that on 2019, the company return on asset is 17.41%. while in 2020 is 14.96%. This means that for every 1 ringgit of asset that is made by the firm, the management of Mr. DIY would able to generate a profit after tax of RM 0.1741 in 2019, while 2020 is RM 0.1496. This has shown a decrease in how the firm generate profits by using its asset if compared 2020 to 2019. The management of Mr. DIY need to take steps to make sure that their return on asset were able to rise. Secondly, return on equity. We can see that on 2019, the firm return on equity are 93.27%, while in 2020 are 38.46%. It shows a decrease if compared to 2019 return on equity. Lower percentage means that the company unable to use the money that had been invested by their investor to generate more profit. And another reason might be the company is facing a tough time for growing. That's all from me. Next, I will pass it to Tashan to continue with the leverage ratio.
Thank you, Gavin, for your comprehensive explanation of the efficiency ratio. A very good day, Madam Najiha. My name is Tarshin and I'm here to discuss the debt ratio. So the debt ratio for Mr. DIY in 2019 is 81.33% and 61.08% in 2020. A debt ratio is a financial ratio that represents a corporation level of indebtedness. The debt ratio is defined as the ratio of total debt to total assets expressed in decimal or percentage terms. It is defined as the proportion of a company's assets that are financed by debt. A ratio greater than 1 shows that a considerable portion of a company's debt is backed by assets, implying that the company has more liabilities than assets. A high ratio indicates that a company is vulnerable to loan default if interest rates unexpectedly rise. A ratio smaller than 1 shows that equity supports a greater share of a company's assets. A debt ratio greater than 1.0, 100% shows that a company's debt surpasses its assets. A debt ratio of less than 100%, on the other hand, indicates that a company has more assets than debt. When paired with other financial health data, the debt ratio can help investors determine a company's risk level. In an industry with volatile cash flow, where most businesses take on limited debt, in the year 2019, more than 81% of the total assets from Mr. DIY is financed using debt. It shows that most of the assets is financed by debt. The higher the ratio, the higher the risk. In the year 2020, more than 61% of the Mr. DIY total assets is financed using debt. This shows decreases if compared to 2019. Besides, this also indicates that Mr. DIY has increased their total assets without borrowing or making loan from the banks. Second is interest coverage ratio. In 2019, Mr. DIY recorded 8.68 times. In 2020, 8.78 times. So, the interest coverage ratio is used to assess a company's ability to pay interest on existing debt. The interest coverage ratio is computed by dividing a company's earning before interest and taxes by its interest expenditures over a specific time period. In general, a larger coverage ratio is preferable, while the optimal ratio varies per industry. The smaller the ratio, the greater the burden of debts, expenses on the organization, and less cash available for other users. When a company's interest coverage ratio is less than 1.5, the capacity to fulfill interest expenditures may be called into doubt. Companies must have more than enough profits to cover interest payments in order to endure future maybe unanticipated financial difficulties. The capacity of a corporation to satisfy its commitments is a facet of its solvency and hence a significant determinant in shareholder return. To cover up its interest expense, the firm are able to cover up to 8.68 times by using its earning before interest and tax. Mr. DIY are able to cover up 8.78 times of the interest expense by using its earnings before interest and tax. It means that there are enough earnings and able to make further borrowings as Mr. DIY are able to pay back the interest. So that's all from me. Thank you for lending your ears, and now I'll pass to Suli to explain on the profitability ratio.
Tarshan for presenting the leverage ratio part. I'm Tae Suli and my matrix number is UDE210127. I'm going to talk about the profitability ratio part. Okay, from this slide, we know that the gross profit margin shows a decrease from 42.65% in the year 2019 to 42.35% in 2020. In the year 2019, for every 1 ringgit of revenue that gained by Mr. DIY, the cost of sales will be RM 0.5735. It has earned RM 0.4265 of gross profit for every 1 ringgit of revenue before paying other business expenses. The company has managed well in the cost of sales as it leads to a higher gross profit margin. In the year 2020, for every 1 ringgit of revenue that gained by Mr. DIY, the cost of sales is RM 0.5765. The company should take steps such as increasing price of goods in order to gain a higher gross profit margin in the next year. Moreover, operating profit margin shows decreases from 22% in the year 2019 to 20.05% in the year of 2020. In the year 2019, for every 1 ringgit of revenue made by Mr. DIY, the revenue was able to cover up to RM 0.78 of total operating expenses. there was a RM 0.22 of profit from the operation after settle the operating expenses. In 2020, for every 1 ringgit of revenue earned, the revenue needs to cover up to amount of RM 0.7950 and only about RM 0.2050 of profit from operation is gained. So Mr. DIY should try to reduce the operating expense to make the business operation more stable. Last but not least, the net profit margin shows a decrease from 13.96% in 2019 to 13.17% in the year 2020. In the year 2019, there are RM 0.1396 of net profit made for every 1 ringgit of revenue after deducting the business expenses. It is more effective the company in converting the revenue to the profit. In the year 2020, RM 0.1317 of net profits was generated from every 1 ringgit of revenue. So it shows a lower margin of safety. That's all for my part. Now I will pass to Gavin and Shaz.
Now, for the recommendation, Mr. DIY is worthy of investment due to high profit in 2019 compared to 2020. This is because Mr. DIY is also one of the company that was affected by COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, which has resulted in a decline in the company performance in the country. Mr. DIY is capable company that and has become well known to many. We also calculate all of the profitability ratios in 2019, which is higher than 2020 based on the statement. What we can see is that the percentage of gross profit margin in 2020 is 42.65% and in 2020 is 42.35%. This percentage indicates that the percentage of gross profit margin in 2019 is higher than 2020, which has a reduction of 0.03%. As for the percentage for operating profit margin in 2019 is higher than 2020. This illustrates that Mr. DIY managed to collect high profit rates. This is due to the fact that the rate of decline in 2020 did not go far enough and resulting in Mr. DIY making too much profit. Mr. DIY has still managed to maintain a reasonable rate of profit even as the world is experiencing a pandemic that has resulted in collapsing the company economy. Furthermore, we analyzed that Mr. DIY is qualified in making investment based on efficiency ratio. We use earnings per share in 2019, in 2019 earnings per share is 5.06% per share, which is lower than 2020, which is 5.37 cent per share. In 2020, there was an increase of 0.31 cent based on the return capital employed ratio used. This ratio is increasing in 2020 from 2019, where 2019 this ratio only 58.90% and in 2020 it is 67.48% and an increase of 8.5%. Due to current unfavorable economic rate, Mr. DIY cannot afford to repay the amount of finance invested by the investors. That will be the end of my explanation. I pass it to Gavin to continue.
Thank you, Shaswani. Next, I will continue with the rest part of the recommendation. The earnings per share in 2019 is 5.06 cent per share, while in 2020 is 5.37 cent per share, shown a decrease if compared to 2019. But this does not mean that Mr. DIY is an unprofitable company in 2020. Besides, investors should also consider investing in Mr. DIY even though the profit rates falls in 2020 if compared to 2019. The main major aspects that affect Mr. DIY profit are caused by the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, and other companies may face the same situation as Mr. DIY in the year of 2020. We analyzed the company's qualification for investment based on the efficiency ratio. From the ratio we got, we can analyze that Mr. DIY is more efficient in 2019 but low efficient in 2020. This is due to there are local and foreign companies that are also affected by the pandemic, which is rampant in 2020 and resulting in a declining economic rate. With this in mind, investors will get a strong return on investment in 2021 and in the next year as the country's economic recovery rate will recover back to the time before the pandemic period. In conclusion, I really hope that Madam really enjoyed this video. That's all from us. Thank you.
I've been flying from town to town, from London to Taiwan. I've been all around the globe trying to protect your soul.